this morning, when I was thinking about what to say about the first day of the forum, I thought, you know what it is? There's a geopolitical cloud hanging over this event, and as bright as things might get, or as bright as the lights are in here, that remains, and there's no, clarity as to whether it's going to move on. But you think that's actually not the most important story.
Well,
what is it?
The geopolitical cloud is not going to go away, because this is not really just about Mr. Putin and his ambitions. It is about Russia reasserting itself in its own neighborhood, and that's kind of historically normal. So I think whether we like that or not, we're going to have to get used to it. But I would say that the real issue for business people is, and was, and will be, what's going on inside the country. You can't really divorce business and politics. Politics trump business all the time. And what we have is, and what we have had, is a situation where a very small group of people are entrenched at the top of the economy. They have bureaucratic power, they have administrative power, they have commercial power, they have political power, and there's no checks or balances. And it's not obvious how you would have a natural, let's say even peaceful way, that we'd have a transition in power.
So there's no way Vladimir Putin can wake up and say, you know what, I'm going to change everything, I'm going to end corruption, I'm going to put my friends that are corrupt in jail, and we're going to start over, we're going to introduce democracy. It's not going to happen.
He could do that because he's one man with a tremendous amount of power. But it's not by any means clear to anybody in the world what's in his head. And that is a question mark that stands over any long-term investment decision that you make in the country. So what's really happened with the Russian economy, predating Ukraine, predating all of the concerns that we have now about Russia's apparent split with the West, is the fact that private capital, specifically Russian private capital, has stayed away from the country. So while the country still has tremendous amount of liquidity, turning cash into investment takes trust. It takes faith in the future. It takes confidence in institutions. Those institutions are not a building at anything like an acceptable rate. In fact, in many cases, we'd say that institutions in this country that govern business environment are actually degraded or stagnated. And when you have a situation like that and real questions that you can't get answers to politically, how do you make a long-term investment decision?
You co-authored an op-ed piece in the New York Times earlier this year where you argue that the economic sanctions imposed against Russia, the sort of financial isolation that Russia has been exposed to, could be more dangerous to American interests than Russia's action in Ukraine. Some people would argue, it was a long op-ed piece, but if I could put it that way, I thought that was one of the more important points. We'll say, well, that's the position of a Russian apologist, though you certainly didn't just sound like one. Explain why you feel that way.
I think sanctions were a tactical answer to a strategic challenge. The strategic challenge is that Russia is the largest country in Europe, and it is asserting its interest in its neighborhood. Whether we like that or not, whether we buy the reasons for it or not, and I certainly have problems with the Russian narrative, full stop. Sanctions are an inadequate response, in my view, and in my co-author's view, to a strategic challenge. In other words, how are we going to deal with a Russia that is going to continue to refuse to be anything other than a full-fledged player at the top of the global league? And how do you collaborate when you need to with a country that you are trying to isolate through a sanctions mechanism, which everybody would acknowledge has costs as well as potential benefits. The potential benefits are not being realized. We still have what we have in eastern Ukraine. We still have a mechanic, a dynamic of increased hostility between the West and Russia, despite sanctions. They haven't done what we wanted them to do. And how do we walk back from them now that we find out that this instrument has been inadequate?
Look, you've done a lot of things here in Russia. I won't go through all of them. You've run Bank of America Merrill Lynch. You started a diner back in the day, just a couple. I mean, you've been in the entrepreneurial space. What would you say to the outside investor? Where are the opportunities now in Russia if there are any?
Ryan, this is a really inefficient economy which is dominated by monopoly and oligopoly. It's internally very uncompetitive. And unfortunately for Russia, that means that the country's competitiveness on a global stage is declining as we speak. But if you're an individual who has a high tolerance for political risk, if you've got a long-term view, and crucially, if you have capital, because capital in this country is scarce, and when you can find it, very expensive. But if you have it, then there are any number of entrepreneurial opportunities in this space because you don't have a lot of competition. There are not a lot of entrepreneurs, and there's plenty of inefficiencies to attack. So just to pick one example, we've been talking about the possibilities of import substitution in Russia as a compelling commercial opportunity for many years. The country digs stuff up out of the ground, and it buys everything it wants from all around the world. Obviously, to the extent that you can do something locally, produce something locally in the food business or any kind of service business, that's an opportunity. It's now become a politically compelling, or political imperative, rather,
against the backdrop of sanctions.
Exactly. And so, of course, there are tremendous opportunities there if you're willing to buy the political risk and you have the means. Personally, that is too high of a bar for me.